welcome to Speak Truth to Power, the magic of Mission 4.7. I'm Rebecca Stevens, Human Rights Education Capacity Building Program Manager at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. And today I'm joined by two change makers, Dr. Helen Bond and Meredith Joo. Dr. Bond is a university professor for Howard University's School of Education in Washington, D.C., and Meredith is a Speak Truth to Power advocate and student at King School in Stamford, Connecticut. Today, they will discuss the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 that seeks to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, and promote sustainable development through transformative education. Welcome, Dr. Bond. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. Before we begin our conversation, I'd like to introduce you to our organization and our program. Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights advocates for human rights issues and pursues strategic litigation to hold governments accountable at home and around the world. And Speak Truth to Power is our human rights education program that combines storytelling and interactive learning to provide the next generation with the concrete knowledge they will need to create change and advance human rights. Meredith is a part of this program and will lead our discussion today. All right, over to you, Meredith.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Dr. Bond, and thank you to all of you watching today. If you have questions for us, please post them in the comments section below and we'll answer them as time permits. Now let's start our discussion. Dr. Bond, before we get started on the meaning of Mission 4.7 and transformative education, what brought you to this moment? It seems that you have been on a mission of your own. Can you describe that mission for our audience?
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you to all, and thank you to the listening and viewing audience this morning, going into afternoon. This is, I think, an important question that I'm often asked, and I think it gives some perspective on what I'm about to say. But also, since we have lots of teachers and educators listening, this kind of question, what brought me to this space, is because I really do believe that you teach who you are. And I was just talking about that to a group of students that I had yesterday evening at Howard University. So I'm going to talk about really who I am, and my perspectives will represent a lot of the stories that my parents have told me. So what brought me to this moment, why I'm often so passionate about these particular topics, is because of what my parents have shared with me growing up. They're originally from the South. And there's several stories and I call them stories that I live by. And really they're stories that I also teach by, because I always keep them in mind. For example, the story of my father, I call it the lynch mob story. A lot of people, in terms of, because we're going to be talking about history a little bit here and some laws that are being passed around that, had passed a woman in the road, a white woman. And even though we think of lynching as a long time ago, a lynch mob actually formed in my grandfather's yard, who come out and really rescued my father in many ways. So it's stories like that, and they're all not necessarily bad stories, but they're stories of people resisting and people staying strong. And there's another story, I often title that the hole in the yard story. My parents ultimately shared with me that where my father lived in Brownsville, Tennessee, that someone had stuck a dynamite in the yard because they were very active with the NAACP, another human rights group. And so he shared with me that they actually played around that particular area. And it was a concept that I really could not really understand. And he also shared another story that I'll wrap up with this, a story of, and it's really an inspirational story to us all, a great uncle, Ollie Bond, who was the forerunner of the development of the NAACP in that particular area, that his home was actually set on fire Christmas Eve night, and that he had to leave for Lawrence, Kansas, ultimately went to New York, continued his advocacy work, and ultimately returned to the area. So these are stories I heard growing up. And of course, my parents were part of the late Great Migration into Ohio. I was raised on a 50-acre farm. So not only did these stories shape my ideas of the world and the justice or lack of justice, my experiences of growing up on a 50-acre farm in rural Ohio, basically in Amish country, and going to a school where there were a few people that looked like me, virtually no teachers that looked like me. And having a tough time, but surviving and ultimately thriving. And so I notice as I go into classrooms, whether in K through 12 or higher education, that I take these memories with me. The thinking about what my parents endured and how they survived, and so I really do. And I was just discussing aspects of this with pre-service teachers just yesterday, and we'll go on to the next question, I'm sure, just next here. That you really do, while you have professional development and teacher education are really important, but there are ideals and thoughts and concepts that you carry in as a teacher that are also important into the learning situation. So thank you for that question, Meredith.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Bond. So could you tell us a little bit about SDG 4 and Target 4.7 and why 4.7 is so special? What's so magical about the mission?
Yeah, I just had someone actually call me up yesterday and says, can you give me a forerunner of what Mission 4.7 is about? I said, well, we have to take a little bit of a back step and think about what the Sustainable Development Goals are, the SDG and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I'm co-chair of SDSN USA. I want to give a great plug, a great shout out to all our member institutions and all those that follow the great work that we do. But the 17 SDG 4 is a part of the 17 SDGs. These are things not that the United Nations have told member states that they should have or want or advocate for, but these are 17 goals. And I framed them in some writing that I did with SDSN USA, that really they're the American dream, but they're the world dream. They begin with SDG 1, no poverty. You work up to SDG 4, which is, we commonly refer to that as quality education, but actually it's a lot more. SDG 4, because you have SDG 5, gender equality, it goes all the way up to what we call the urban SDG to rid inequality in cities, to climate, to land, the oceans. But SDG 4 is very important. It's more than just quality education. It reads to ensure inclusive and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning. So to think about SDG 4.7, we have to think about SDG 4. And it has 10 targets, which are things that targets are what we're working for in terms of, for example, gender parity in education, pre-primary access to education, having quality teachers. But what sets 4.7 apart, besides being important with SDG 4, because quality education is a driver of development. You can't reach any, and the SDGs are interlinked. So you can't achieve any of the other SDGs without having SDG 4. So it's a main driver of development. Now, 4.7, what's so special about it? It really, and all the targets and indicators are the metrics by which we determine if we reach the targets. They're all important. But specifically, I want to highlight the specialness of 4.7, which I'm going to define in a minute. We mentioned at the beginning, begins with 4.5. And that's the elimination of all discrimination in education. That's critical, because you can't achieve 4.7 without thinking about the barriers that prevent societies and groups from obtaining a quality education. So 4.7, this is our title, this is our mission, this is our focus for today. And often we shortcut that, and I've had a lot of discussions with SDSN USA. We have a working group. Professor Radhika Ingar is leading that at Teachers College in Columbia. We're doing a wonderful job. They're preparing for a summit. But 4.7 is more than just education for sustainable development, although that's a critical piece of it. And I just want to sort of read a little bit in terms of the definition for that. By 2030, 4.7 outlines that in order to promote and achieve sustainable development, which is at the core of 4.7. So education for sustainable development is at the core, but you achieve that through human rights education is named in 4.7. Gender equality is named in 4.7. The promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence is named in 4.7. Often we shortcut that. If you want to think about, sometimes people think about education for sustainable development as the umbrella. Others think about it as global citizenship education, which is named as one of the processes to achieve 4.7, a more sustainable and peaceful world. But it's also named in that particular part of SDG 4, an appreciation of cultural diversity. And importantly, and when I was preparing for this, and I think about this a lot, and I think this is really understated a bit, the role of cultural diversity in the achievement, not only of SDG 4.7, but an SDG 4 in terms of quality education. So, and a lot of times people will, it's SDG 4.7 is framed in global citizenship education, which is really important as well. So you have all these aspects pulled together. You have education for sustainable development, you have global citizenship education, you have human rights education. Sometimes you think about peace education, the focus on culture. And so while literacy and numeracy is important, and this is not a downplay because that's part of SDG 4, the education for peace and sustainable development and culture, because you cannot have sustainable development in the absence of peace and in the absence of appreciation of other people and tolerance and empathy. It just will not occur in such context. We were in New York, SDSN was meeting, and we were meeting with our executive council. We had other meetings that people that we were talking, but one consensus that came out of those many meetings around advancing the SDGs and all the good work that organizations like Brookings, SDSN USA, UN USA, United Nations, focused in Washington, the UN Foundation, all the good work that they're doing. You cannot really achieve these goals in the absence of peace and a lack of respect for cultural diversity. And I want to just, and I know we're going to go on to the next question here, but I want to punctuate that because we're moving, I won't say we're moving into an era. I think we've been in this era for a while, but where very much so these ideals, the ability to achieve SDG 4 and 4.7 is going to be difficult. There are various barriers that are currently taking place in our political and social climate that's going to make SDG 4 difficult, quality education, as well as 4.7. I know that's a very long answer, a lot of things there, but 4.7 is special because with literacy, with numeracy, with all the other skills that we bring in as teachers and educators, in the midst of conflict, without an appreciation and respect for difference and culture and for our histories, whether we are uncomfortable with them or not, a really full, robust education cannot be achieved. And I really can't state that enough.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. So kind of picking up on your previous response, you mentioned in your work as SDSN USA co-chair and faculty at Howard University that this transformative notion of education is under attack. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
It really is. And I have to say that, and we have a lot of educators online, and I don't think we are as aware of just how much what we're doing is actually under attack. Just a couple weeks ago, we had Professor Kimberly Crenshaw at Howard University. I'm also an executive council member. I want to put in a plug for our Center for Women, Gender, and Global Leadership. She was speaking. She's a professor of law at Columbia, and she was talking about the push against critical race theory and its role in K through 12 schools and what that means, and that we aren't quite raising our voices enough as we should. And I was doing also some work at SDSN, still wrapping some of that up. But the passage of anti-critical race theory laws and bills are really a direct threat against 4.7. Now, let me say for our listening audience, critical race theory is a theory that typically has emerged from legal theory, from critical legal studies, and various proponents and groups inside, outside education have argued that critical race theory is being taught in K through 12 public schools. You've probably read and heard about this, and we know that critical race theory is not being taught in K through 12 schools. I just want to stop there and just pause for a minute. But it has implications for K through 12 education. Now, what implications am I talking about? And then I have some statistics here on how many bills have been passed around this, and I'll get to that next. So what are the implications? For example, there's a group called the Florida Alliance that has construed and made statements, and it's on their website, that critical race theory, they have broadened the umbrella. They talk about code words to watch out for diversity, for gender equity, for culturally responsive teaching. I just submitted an article for a chapter around the role of critical race theory and culturally responsive practices. So they're considering, even in K through 12 education, what educators commonly call, culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching. That's the other CRT. That is under the umbrella now of what they're considering these anti-critical race theory laws and bills that are being pushed through state houses. So it's no longer critical race theory as applied in higher education, although some of these bills are targeting higher education. They're specifically targeting diversity training, anything around gender, sexuality education, culturally responsive practices, and consider this. And if you want to find out more about it, and hopefully our educators and our advocates and activists will, that PEN America is really following and tracking, as well as other groups, this CRT legislation. 54 bills, 54 bills were introduced in the first 9 months of 2021. 2022, and then I'll give you some examples. Proposed bills have increased by 250% compared to 2021. 137 bills have been introduced in 2022, but there's not something different, but it's actually accelerated in certain ways. The passage of, now PEN America calls these educational gag orders, and that's one way to look at it. But I see this as a direct threat against quality education, SDG 4, and democracy. But what's changed in 2022? When you take a look at this, that the language in these bills have become a lot more harsh. They're threatening fines, they're threatening people to be disciplined, funding to be withheld, to be named and shamed perhaps as well. So they become a lot more punitive. Also, you'll see a number of these titled anti-critical race theory bills, which I argue that, and the sort of name that I put on that is really determining what teachers can teach and what students can learn. And it's also a denial and an erasure and a minimization of a lot of historical and present day practices. So that's how I frame it. And so if you, for example, I just have a few notes here. I was looking at Missouri's Senate Bill 22. It was just introduced on September 14, 2022. And it really, and a lot of the language, not just Missouri, but if you look at these bills, a lot of the language refers to divisive concepts, that we don't want any divisive concepts or indoctrination, or these are some overall general themes. And I'll get back to SB 22, because it really does sort of define all of that. But it talks about teachers not going into the area of divisive concepts, of indoctrination, or mentioning or teaching things that might make some groups uncomfortable or feel blamed for history. If you look at some of the legislation at large, it sort of reads as if they're actually promoting diversity until you really get down into the language and into the bill. And generally, all of them talk about, for example, SB 22, an individual by virtue of his race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. That's a common theme across the bills. Some actual language in Senate Bill 22 out of Missouri. Assigning blame is a common, teaching both sides. You know, I think we saw a little bit on television. One particular state was talking about teaching both sides to the Holocaust. What are those both sides? Totally out of line there. And there's also this notion in these bills of what we call bearing collective guilt. So you have a range of bills being passed that are cloudy in the language, but referring to those basic concepts, putting teachers on edge of what they can say, what they can do, what books that they can have in their classrooms. And let me say this, because even though we think about these are arcane bills that perhaps no one will enforce, but again, in 2022, there's a lot harsher fines and penalties with that. The natural outgrowth, not natural, but how this is being implemented in K through 12, you see this in book challenges and banning, this notion of book banning. I always say you don't ban books, you ban people, you ban ideas, you ban histories, you ban those stories that we live by, you ban those stories that we teach by. So it's more than just banning books, but it's a very, very disconcerting. I want to, for those that would like to follow up and to learn more, and we hope that you do, the American Library Association, the ALA, have tracked 729 attempts to restrict or ban books in 2021, the highest number that they've ever tracked. But if you look at ALA's website, what was interesting, I was just looking at it prior to our start today, you can look back at banned books from decades. They have from 2010 to 2019, you know, and the top 100 most banned books. And you really start seeing some really disturbing themes. And what you see, first of all, you see an overlap. You see an association, a congruence, almost a convergence of the CRT, anti-CRT laws, first of all, where they're being primarily promulgated, and an overlap with books that are being banned. Actually, in some of the CRT laws, you even have reference, and many times you have reference to teachers using certain curricula, and these curricula shouldn't promote diversity and other things. But two main themes in terms of the book banning or challenges. So what do we mean by a challenge? A book challenge, and you often see public libraries being challenged. So this is not just in K through 12 education, although it is, but you also see libraries being challenged for offering certain kinds of library materials. And so libraries have taken to what people are referring to, and what I'm referring to is what we call preemptive banning, or sometimes anticipatory I won't say self-banning, but anticipatory banning. They see a particular book and they think that this might cause a challenge or conflict or an uproar in the community, or maybe an attempted challenge. And so maybe they move those books to a different shelf or a different place, or not even, or put them in the back, or not even perhaps put them on the library shelf for open access. Just quickly, I was talking with a student at Howard University. This has been about a month ago. And she was sharing with me, she was actually at a library sort of community center, and she was like stocking shelves, and that they were even concerned about being challenged about certain books. So you have libraries, and certainly you have schools where challenges have been raised, the challenges where a parent or an outside group or maybe an administrator or even a politician, because politics does play a very big role in this. I always talk about the CRT laws and book bannings are really proxies. It's really what I call the language of proxies. You know, you're arguing for CRT legislation and book bans, but what's really behind that? That's really proxying for something else. But in terms of K through 12 education and some of the themes around the banning of the books, what we're seeing, and someone was asking me, what are the two kinds or the major kinds of books that you see being banned or challenged? And you're seeing themes. I'm thinking about the top 10 books challenged, banned for 2021. 7 or 8 of them deal with sexuality and gender, and the rest typically around race. But if you look at this on a larger scale, that a lot of the books that are being banned are by or about sometimes BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Black and Brown Indigenous authors, or subjects around race. Typically, the books that are being challenged are often tied with the concepts in the anti-critical race theory legislation. So you're seeing a real nexus there. So, for example, the number one, our listening audience, can you, if you could chat now, what do you think would be the number one most banned book for 2021 out of the 10? The title of the book is Genderqueer. The second one is Lawn Boy. Third is All Boys Aren't Blue. Then you have The Hate You Give. Typically, if you look across some of the years, you'll see the absolute true, I think it's Diary of a Part-Time Indian. Out of the top 10 for 2021, you have Me, Earl, and The Dying Girl, The Bluest Eye, Beyond Magenta. But if you look at some of the list, if you go down further than just the top 10, you'll see Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. You'll see on one particular list, it was I think it was the top 100 of the last decade. Number 52 was the Bible. You'll see recently in Pennsylvania, a school district. It's been a little controversy around that, but reported on by sources that, and it's been some things on television about that as well, that Girls Who Code, that series, was challenged, not banned, but challenged in a district in Pennsylvania. You've had Moss, by a Holocaust, a story of a Holocaust survivor's family that was challenged. And so you've had books around Ruby Bridges being challenged. And I was actually writing and discussing that with a teacher friend of mine. She was saying, well, why would a book about Ruby Bridges, be challenged? And so when you get into, and you go back and you read that story in depth, there was a parent that didn't like the looks on the crowd's faces, the surrounding, there was an angry white crowd. They had a picture there that's often shown when Ruby Bridges is on her way to the school, of a very angry white mob. And there was someone that was offended by the picture. And so that book, it wasn't banned, but it was indeed challenged. So you see a real nexus. And I created a story map where we're still working on it a little bit with SDSN USA, and we'll go on to the next question, that shows the areas, regions, states where you see a lot of CRT bills. You often see the same areas in regions such as Texas, huge, Florida, huge, even Pennsylvania. You'll see a lot of book challenges, sometimes banned, but certainly a lot of challenges. So I just, and I just, as we go on to the next question, these ideas and themes that are being challenged include things that teachers, all of us do in our practice, have a culturally affirming practice using, this is common in teacher education, schools of teacher education, using culturally responsive pedagogy. That's actually named, as I said before, in a piece of CRT legislation. So that could fall up under suspect. And so this is making things very difficult for teachers. As a teacher educator, my PhD is human development. I teach a lot of ed psych courses and human development courses. I have to talk to students about ways to navigate this, to understand what's going on, to be courageous. You know, again, we teach who we are, and we can be better than who we were yesterday and before. And as teachers, we are leaders, and we must lead and raise our voices in this fight.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. That's definitely a very concerning development that we'll have to keep our eyes on in the future. So you served as fellow at the George Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research in Braunschweig, Germany, at the Leibniz Institute for Educational Media. I understand you research how textbooks in the US and around the world portray the Black freedom struggle, and in particular, the US civil rights movement. What do textbooks have to do with Mission 4.7?
Yeah, a lot of times people don't think textbooks, they're just germane textbooks on a shelf. And let me say that I also published a piece in the Eckert Bulletin, just a snippet of my research. And what I'm looking at, and first of all, let me give kudos to the wonderful international textbook library that they have. It's one of the few, if not the only in the world, that really does divided and categorized by country, have basically all the textbooks for many, many years back. And it's really a wonderful place, and they do wonderful work. And so what I focus on is looking at the civil rights movement, how it's portrayed in textbooks. But getting back to the overall germane question, textbooks are seen by many as authoritative, that what's in a textbook is the truth. That is the way it is. The way the history is presented is the way it's neutral. It's not biased in any way. Often teachers teach by textbooks. Textbooks can kind of subscribe or outline in things in ways teachers teach, whether they're digital or whether they're hard copies or either way. Textbooks often contain, this is the importance of textbooks, and how textbooks can often set the pace. But textbooks can also be full of conflict and contradictory information. Often when you research textbooks, you'll find that, teachers use them to the kinds of assessments that they use in class, the kinds of questions that are generated. Teachers typically follow the textbooks. And often textbooks and the history, the language, is really a representation of the state, of what the state or what that particular state or culture deems as important. Let me give you an example. Just here recently, and textbooks often reflect standards as well. Again, we have to mention the name state of Texas. In 2022, they're looking at their social studies curriculum, and we know that Texas and California are large textbook states. And sometimes they can lead in terms of the kinds of textbooks that are out, but they've actually proposed to not mention slavery, use the word slavery in the curriculum, but actually used involuntary relocation. So they've put together a committee that's actually looking at that. There are some university professors on that particular committee. They've actually have a Senate bill that's sort of supporting that, fleshing that out. It's more of an anti-CRT legislation, tying all these pieces together, ties textbooks with anti-CRT, books banning and challenges. So slavery goes from slavery to involuntary relocation. Now, a history professor that I really, and many wonderful history professors, but Annette Gordon-Reed commented on that, and her statements really resonated with me. She talked about that young kids can grasp the concept of slavery. because a lot of times the argument in the CRT legislation and the book banning and challenges, these are divisive concepts, they're inappropriate, it's inappropriate for the use of children. And we know that educators are very mindful of what's developmentally appropriate. Teacher educators focus on that with their classrooms. But what this is really a reversal, or a minimization and an erasure, really, of the historical trauma of slavery and its precedents and what it's done and how it really reflects itself even today. And Annette Gordon-Reed says, if adopted, the country is moving in the wrong direction. But what this other statement, when I was reading a little bit of her work, really, I thought was really impactful and important. And I very much so believe it and support it. She argues and she says, tell children the truth. They can handle it. And I absolutely do. And I absolutely do believe that. Because how we, and textbooks play a great role in shaping how we think about historical things. And if I have just one quick second to just one more example, that came out of my particular research, that things have gotten better. So things can improve. We can be optimistic that change can happen. Because if you look back at books about Rosa Parks, some of the older, even in textbooks, I found that textbooks often portrayed her as being tired and old, and she'd worked all day, so she didn't want to give up her seat because she's tired. And the truth is that Rosa Parks has a long history of activism with the NAACP and being trained in these kinds of methods, but her agency is stripped in many textbooks and books accounts. But if you look at some of the new work that's coming out in textbooks around Rosa Parks, you don't see that as much. So there is optimism that things can improve.
So our next question is, what role can educators play and what can they do to help us better respond to the current challenges that you've mentioned in today's schools?
Educators play a huge role. Because often you can go online and you can watch videos of these very rancorous, heated school board meetings where you have a handful, sometimes not even a handful, of challengers, objectors, distractors, or people that are challenging a book or challenging something. But you don't hear from the often a larger majority of people that don't support that feel that this book or textbook or this, is appropriate and can be taught in appropriate ways in the classroom. We often don't hear from teachers. Teachers are somewhat silenced in this, but they're in a precarious position as well. So they have to balance, but there are ways in which that they can work with others, with nonprofit groups, with the teachers' unions, to really, talk about their concerns, to talk about that, critical race theory is not, taught in K through 12 schools. However, we do use culturally responsive teaching practices because they're good practices, using culturally affirming examples and role models and using diverse literature is important for a diverse democracy. It's important that children learn and respect others. And so we often, and there are ways that, and there are also ways that you can teach to broaden what's in a textbook. If there's something that and because it's important to build a culture of evidence, a lot of things that's referred to in the anti-CRT bills and in the book bannings, it's often based around myth and misinformation. You can talk and teach children about building a culture of evidence. That's often what we refer to in media literacy. What are the facts here? What is the evidence? So teachers have a great role. This is something that's impacting them. We've lost teachers from the teaching force because this is a lot of stress. There was something in the news around an Oklahoma teacher that was, ended up, quitting her position. She had books in her classroom that was, someone asked her to actually cover them up. So this is a lot of stress on teachers who are already stressed, doing wonderful work. And the basis of our education system. One of the targets of SDG 4, just looping this around to show how SDGs and 4.7 plays a role here. Having quality teachers, being able to teach in a quality way is one of the targets of SDG 4. And this is, of course, places teachers really at the center of this. And so teachers and their supporters, we don't, parents have a role in this. We have generally a small group of people challenging these things, and we don't hear the voices of people that are impacted the most. And that includes students as well. There has been some student resistance. So my large, very small answer to that is we need to resist more. And there are lots of ways we can resist, and maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A as we move forward.
Yes. So actually our next question picks up right from your previous response as well. So for the students out there who aren't within school systems that are working to address the challenges you mentioned, what advice would you give them, and what can students do on their own to transform their education?
Yes, students have a huge voice. Young people have a huge voice. And let me say, I'm very much a student and a person that appreciates what I call the new sociology of childhood. That, children and youth are important, not for the adults that we project them to be one day, mostly the status quo as we see it, but who they are and the importance of their ideas today. And they are indeed change makers. So students that are being denied the ability to read Moss or Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, or Girls Who Code, or some of the other many books that have been banned or challenged, can speak out. They can write letters. They can make phone calls. They can, make their voices heard. Even, and of course, they use social media. That's a great way to highlight some of these things that are happening. Because I don't think, because a lot of these ideas are buried in these arcane 30-page pieces of legislation introduced primarily by Republicans, and people haven't really, and especially young people. I mean, a lot of people aren't going to sit down and look through that, but to really pay attention to what's happening politically, and to recognize that if they're of voting age, that voting is extremely important, because even though we're talking about the educational sphere and we're talking about SDG 4, these are really political agendas, very much so. And so to make their voices known in terms of politics, supporting local schools, attending school board meetings, so really getting involved. And I think young people are great at that. They often organize and get involved via social media, which is great, but you also have to be wary. There's a lot of misinformation. A lot of these groups that are raising challenges are doing it in really inappropriate and misinformation ways via social media.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. We actually have a question coming in from Facebook. The bills all seem to be aimed at minimizing the histories and experiences of Black, Brown, LGBTQ, and First Nations people. In the pushback, do you see these groups working together?
Absolutely. And certainly I think the groups need to work together more, but there's a lot of working together that's being done now, heightening the awareness around this. For example, I think within the last 2 weeks, we had a colleague of mine, she's a co-chair at SDSN USA in the Diversity, Equity, and Justice Working Group. And I want to give a shout out to all my co-chairs, Victor Udu, Deepa Viekas, and Claudia Roma Edelman. So Claudia and her team from Hispanic Star worked with Howard University, the Ralph Bunche International Center, and the School of Education at Howard University. We put on Hispanic Heritage Month. And so we talked about some of these issues and how different groups can work together and to support the openness and to support these causes. But these groups have worked together and hopefully will continue. But I think we can certainly do more of that, because as the person pointed out, the books that are being challenged are definitely focused around race, LGBTQ issues, sexuality, and that particular frame. And I also make, just really quickly, there's also a bit of overlap in the states that are also restricting access to abortion. You do see a little bit of association there as well. So we'll go on to the next question, but thank you, questioner.
We have another one from Twitter. How did critical race theory become almost a bad word for so many people that they feel threatened by anything even remotely related to it in our education?
You know, because if you think back, you know, various politicians that have, especially running in the presidential race, have brought, sometimes CRT is called the boogeyman of this upcoming political election series. But other kinds of things like this have been raised and expanded, and a lot of misinformation around it. For example, in the election of Trump, he talked about the scary immigrant. In times past, you had the specter of the welfare queen. And so you have these, they're really proxies for fear mongering. And I always say, I had a discussion in New York with SDSN USA co-chair about this. It's definitely fear mongering. And as he better said than I, but I certainly agree with it, that people who are fearful really make bad decisions. And what this is, it's a fear of demographic change in the United States. There are people, of course, it's the replacement theory. They see white supremacy and the demographic changes with the growth of certain communities, the Hispanic community, the Asian American community, and other communities as a threat to their sovereignty, which is unfortunate because we are a country of immigrants. We are a diverse republic, and that is what makes America so special.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. Our last question is, in conclusion, where do you see society in 20 to 30 years from now? And will this moment pass? Or, yeah, what are your thoughts?
You know, when I think about questions like that, I think about, you know, will this moment pass? This moment will pass, but the issues often don't unless we do something, unless we take action. For example, slavery initially passed, but it was replaced by slavery, not involuntary relocation. Slavery passed, but then it was replaced by sharecropping. Then it was replaced by penal labor or labor from prison labor. So while I do think certain aspects of this will pass, this fear, this fear of others that are different, the fear of being replaced in power may not pass unless it'll evolve into something else. And I very much so believe in the ideas of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, in terms of if we really want to change the world, we really want to get people thinking a different way and to be thoughtful and respectful, you must begin with children and in schools. So while the moment may pass, the drivers of this moment doesn't pass. It just drives into the future and appears as something else unless we all take action and pay attention to what's happening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. Oh, we actually have one more question. Sorry. What are some specific ways teachers can immediately integrate transformative education into their classrooms?
An immediate way, and that's why I talk so much about the book bannings and challenges and this notion of textbooks, is really using good children's literature, children and youth literature. Books are a gateway to introducing your students to other people's, other ways of thinking, to people that they may not normally meet. So children's literature is important. And so some immediate ways I always say would be to read a banned book and to actually talk about, well, what's so scary about this book? Why is it being banned? And to hold a discussion around it. Again, I very much so agree with Annette Gordon-Reed, telling children the truth and the truth about our history. And some other immediate ways is not to shy away from things that are uncomfortable. You ask, why are we so shy about talking about various aspects of our history? Because it doesn't conform slavery and the brutality of slavery. And what followed it. Slavery just didn't end, and we're here today. Sharecropping, Jim Crow, Reconstruction. How we understand what really happened in Reconstruction will inform us on policies today. We're never free of our past, but it often doesn't conform with what we like to think of ourselves as manifest destiny, as the society on the hill, as a diverse society. But I argue in terms of what we can do, and this is another sentiment that we can also take in our classrooms as we talk about education for democracy. And I think that needs to be a key point. I think telling the real story, that you have evidence, building that culture of evidence, telling the true story of America. Yes, you build up on slave labor, stolen land, but the true story in its fullness is a really much more impactful story because we have made gains. We have done some things to be very proud of. I mean, we are not the country we were 50 or 100 years ago. Some of those drivers are still there. But telling U.S. history in all its complexity. So I really love literature around history that brings history, make it accessible, but make it accurate today, I think is one great way to as immediacy. So we can tell a stronger, more accurate, more optimistic story if we tell the truth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond. And I know I've said last question for the past few questions, but from LinkedIn, Tom wants to know, with the use of tech being so prevalent among today's youth, is there an opportunity to partner with educational technology to course correct and supplement the use of books?
Absolutely. To make these kinds of corrections, especially in textbooks and literature, if you work with ebooks and in the publishing, I think it does, make the availability to make corrections per se. But I think it's very important to partner or to be responsive to school boards and textbook review committees and what's happening often on the local level, because even though we can identify these things in textbooks and they can be pulled from shelves, and if they're e-texts, they can be, often easier to fix or to make corrections. It's the sentiment that's driving people to not want to include slavery in textbooks and to sort of rename it. Really, it's minimizing it. So taking action in those areas, I think, is really important. I see some other questions coming in.
Yes.
Herschel Walker, I see.
Yes. Is Herschel Walker an example of using fear and proxy?
Okay. I'm not sure what Herschel Walker is right at the moment. But I can say this. if you look at the drawback of freedom and rights in terms of women reproductive rights, the United States is one of 4 countries in the world that have digressed in the realization and the implementation of reproductive rights and freedoms for women. And so all these things, these are what I call the drivers. Where are we going to be in 20 years? You know, what's up underneath this pullback of freedoms? And this is happening conjointly. You've got CRT bills being passed. You've got books being banned and challenged. You've got women that have lost key reproductive rights and freedoms. And, you know, I want to go back to the 20-year question. Where will we be in 20, 30, 40, or 50 years? You know, as in many things throughout our history, that's why I think telling it the way it is with a culture of evidence, I'd like to look back 20, or we can look back 20, 30 years and say, oh my gosh. And of course, things are better. We don't have CRT legislation. And look back and say, my gosh, what were we thinking? You know, we read in our histories about, you know, during a period of time in which women were accused of being witches, some were hanged and burned. And we read about other atrocities and we look back and think, oh my gosh, what were we thinking? But I do want to say, as we look forward, I was making a talk to a local NAACP group, maybe a year ago. And in terms of what I call the look back, the great look back. And I was saying that Martin Luther King says, you know, the universe, the laws of the universe and the future, it bends the arc of justice, and it, you know, it's going to bend toward justice. And I said, it will only bend toward justice if there are people actively trying to bend it. You know, we just can't ride the escalator of the future. We can't ride the escalator of 10 to 20 years and say, well, you know, things get better on their own, you know, or it's always been this way. You know, there are things you can do. These things are not inevitable. You know, things aren't going to get better. We're not going to look back 30 years and say, my gosh, what were we thinking if we don't do something? And I can't argue enough, you know, appreciating the role of history, telling things as they are in all its good, bad, and indifference and ugliness and whatever. It's important, again, because how we do we understand slavery as this brutal, chattel slavery, as this brutal system that ripped people from their native land? The transatlantic slave trade brought people across the water. Do we appreciate the indignities of the slavery in Barbados and the Caribbean, where slave life wasn't valued? They would, if we don't, we can't understand the inequities in wealth, health today, and the discrimination and the pseudoscience that built up around race that was, that played itself out during the Holocaust. We know that Hitler used a lot of the laws and the policies in the United States to inform what they were doing, unfortunately, there. If we don't have an appreciation of that, we see the way things are today in a different light. We just see people who, just complain, and then maybe they're not working hard enough. We don't appreciate the past. And that's why textbooks I'm very, very concerned about, because one thing I noticed I was looking at textbooks from all around the world to a degree at the what I call the long Black freedom struggle. And I did not see a lot about eugenics. And so this pseudoscience of race that played really an important role in atrocity crimes, as well as what happened in the United States. But I did have a teacher in my graduate class at Howard University a month ago, and mentioned that he was talking about, he's a history teacher, a social studies teacher, and he was actually teaching about eugenics. And so I said, well, you know, there is optimism. So
Thank you so much, Dr. Bond, for speaking with us today. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of you who tuned in today to be part of this conversation. If you enjoyed this event, let us know by sharing it with your friends, followers, and connections. And remember to follow RFK Human Rights on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, Twitter, or YouTube so you can be one of the first people to learn about our next event. Thank you for watching.
thank you.